What is up, everybody? Welcome back to TCC. I am Fiorella, and pardon me, I just got done with a massively busy time at RT. There's a lot going on lately in the news. As you all know, the NATO summit has wrapped up, and we're going to be discussing that. I had to give my breakdown of the NATO summit and what I think was actually accomplished, considering the fact that so much was not accomplished for Ukraine, unlike the Western media would have you believe that everything is fine and they're the best of friends. We've seen the opposite coming from uh, just inner squabbles between Zelensky and the Western leaders. So I'm going to mostly talk about that. But I do want to start off by mentioning breaking news because Vladimir Putin attended a what's called a forum of technology, a technological forum of in Moscow, and he met with people who are developing technology in Russia. Now, I'm only going to discuss certain parts of this because I do want to have some more people on to discuss, see more other aspects of what he talked about because he talked about a lot of things. Uh, but one of the things that he really highlighted was Russia's technological sovereignty. They want to have national sovereignty through their technology, and that's something that I can understand, given this idea of national sovereignty that I've seen promoted by many countries that have been interfered with, including Nicaragua, which I'll be there next week, Venezuela, Cuba. These countries just want to have their own, make their own decisions in their own affairs. And so we're seeing this idea of national sovereignty be really emphasized by a lot of the BRICS countries and the countries that are pushing this idea of multipolarity, which I've discussed many times. It is a real thing. Now, in terms of the technology aspect, he did mention data-driven economy. And as we all know, the Russian ruble is also going to be put into a digital format. Now, I will have more of a discussion on that later on as to what that means. But I will say that Russia is in no way trying to connect their economy to NATO or Europe because they are diametrically opposed to what Europe is doing. Um, but I will have more of a discussion on that. The idea of national sovereignty was also backed by the fact that Putin also said sanctions against Russia have forced Russia to develop certain sectors of technology, including computing and all sorts of things. So that is something he said. Now, following the technological forum, he then had a press conference where he addressed the press during a conference where he was asked several questions, and the questions mainly centered around Russia, Ukraine, and the conflict there. And he did talk a little bit about that. So I do have a video from that, but I will say that one of the things he said that was the most vital thing at this press conference was that Russia will not extend the grain deal unless Ukraine and the West comply with their side of the agreement. Now, this was a harsh criticism that many people in Russia, many Russian supporters, and many more so pundits and analysts were angry rather than Russians themselves, I would say. But people who have been following this conflict and the Black Sea grain deal that was mediated via Turkey, right? They have been upset that Russia still decided to renew the grain deal in spite of the fact that Ukraine basically disrespected them at every aspect. And so that was one of the criticisms that people were saying. It shows Russia's being weak. It shows Russia is still going to do their part while Ukraine and NATO are not doing their part. Well, Vladimir Putin has said Russia cannot restore the Black Sea grain deal until the West does their part. Now, he specifically mentioned also that the grain is still going to Europe, including Ukraine, and it's not going to developing countries in need, specifically countries in Africa. This is something that's been highlighted time and time again by both Vladimir Putin and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Now, why is this important? Well, because this has been this sort of caveat used to attack Russia. If they don't go through the grain deal, Russia is starving all poor people. But the reality is, who is doing that is Europe, because they are still taking the vast majority of this grain deal. So that is something that you are going to see talked about in the coming days in the news, and the significance of this statement and what that means. And I think it means that Russia is pushing back a little bit more. They are trying to really respond to the recent escalations, not just the F-16s and the cluster munitions that have been approved by the United States and the Biden administration, but also the escalations of the expansion of NATO. NATO wants to expand in the Asia Pacific. This is something that's also been talked about. And of course, countries that have seen the devastation that the United States and other European governments have caused through their interference and interventions, countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, especially these countries that also suffered and continue to suffer from cluster munitions, are not keen on that. And of course, neither is China, who sees this as an escalation towards its territorial one China policy in the region. However, Vladimir Putin did also address that, and he said that no country should, the security should outweigh the needs of other countries, essentially saying that no country's national security should cause more conflicts. Let's listen to what Vladimir Putin said in this video, and then I'll continue talking about the NATO summit. I think we have a loading issue. Can just replay it.
It has the right to choose the best way it thinks for that. There is only one limitation, restriction, because ensuring the security of one country should not create threats for the security of other countries. And this principle that has been many times declared in various international documents, we hope that it is observed and respected. Of course, Ukraine has the right to ensure its security. The draft of the document that I mentioned many times, namely the draft of an agreement between Russia and Ukraine that was prepared in Istanbul, and that was later thrown out in the garbage by the Ukrainian regime. That draft had a very detailed description of matters of ensuring Ukraine's security. And we should probably have thought better whether we agree with everything that was set forth in that document. But, well, as for now, there is no surprise for us that NATO and G7 have declared. But I repeat once again, mandatory condition is ensuring the security of the Russian Federation. As for security,
so Vladimir Putin was talking about the agreement that basically Kiev just threw out the window, and then he also mentioned the fact that this conflict could have ended if Ukraine had respected and wanted to come to the negotiation table. He also talked about the Russian military really having the upper hand, and that Ukraine's counteroffensive was not producing what Ukraine wanted. And so that is something that that Russia thinks is the reality. And what we're seeing on the battlefield in terms of Ukraine is that Ukraine is losing weapons, Ukraine is losing people, they're losing their soldiers. They're having obviously this draft where you're seeing videos of people being literally forced into the military and used as cannon fodder for this continued conflict. Now, this is all escalating, of course, due to the more weapons being sent. Joe Biden, and of course, is sending billions more on top of course, the cluster munitions, as well as Europe sending more tanks, Germany, and others are committing to more jets and tanks. And Russia sees this as an escalation. Now, the NATO summit itself, though, what it signified for Ukraine is, in my opinion, a complete failure in reality. There's two realities. There's reality, and then there's the appearance, the public relations that NATO and the West have put out. NATO and the West have said that they're going to stand by Ukraine, they're going to support Ukraine, that they're going to do whatever they can. But Ukraine and Zelensky did not get what they wanted. They literally did not get an admission into NATO. And we knew this wouldn't happen because Jens Stoltenberg had said as much, as did the United States officials, that this wasn't going to happen, that Russia was not going to be admitted until they actually had a victory, that Ukraine was not going to be admitted until they had a victory over Russia. So that wasn't going to happen. But of course, till the last minute, you were seeing this idea pushed out by media. What happened was that there seemed to be this rift between Zelensky and several key members of NATO and several Western officials. He started going on Twitter and criticizing NATO for not helping them more. And the response was, you should be grateful for what you've gotten. And then he backtracked and said he was grateful enough. And so that was the essential back and forth between Zelensky. And what that showed was that they're not as unified as they would have you think, that Ukraine is basically being used as a proxy. And nothing has made that more clear than this NATO summit, that Ukraine was used as a proxy to get to Russia, to agitate Russia, to target Russia. And Zelensky really was presented this, and we saw all the memes. And I'm going to start with the real picture, because I, for a second, was like, is this even a real picture? It is. And this was Zelensky at the NATO summit, looking isolated. Now, you know, there's those body language experts that say you could determine a lot through body language. Well, this is one case where you could say Zelensky looked like a lonely man. He looked like an outcast. And, you know, here he is coming to NATO, and look at how he's dressed. He's dressed like he's some sort of army official. And that is, of course, a PR marketing move to make you think that Zelensky is constantly on the front lines, when we know he is actually constantly behind in front of a green screen. And so that was something that is obviously done on purpose. But, you know, he shows up to this summit and he's not getting the admission he wants, but he is getting more ammunition, he's getting more weapons, he's getting this whole, you know, platitudes that we support Ukraine, we're going to do everything we can to support Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And so, but is that enough really to help Ukraine win this conflict? It isn't. Ukraine is not going to win this conflict in spite of all the ammunitions. And what is actually ever dangerous is the escalation that is happening by the United States and NATO via these more weapons, particularly the cluster munitions. And by the way, Spain, the UK, and I believe it was Germany and others have voiced their opposition to the United States sending these cluster munitions, which they're not part of this treaty, but those three countries are part of the cluster munition treaty, which bans their use. So that is another part of this rift that we're seeing in NATO. Also, the other thing I want to add before I go on to more about the summit was that these countries in Europe, particularly Germany, France, and perhaps Spain, I would say, these countries are feeling the brunt of the fallout from the economic disaster that this conflict has been for them. They have been pretty much just, destroyed in terms of the economic sector via the energy industry. And they are they're not happy about this. I mean, they are realizing, and I'm not just talking about the citizens that we've seen protesting against NATO throughout these countries. I'm talking about the officials. A German official actually said that they are not in agreement with what's happening and sending more and more weapons to Ukraine. That they're done with this. And now the question is that sentiment much bigger than they make it seem, than the Western media has allowed for us to see? That maybe more and more officials are starting to see that this conflict is not winnable for Europe or NATO, and maybe they're starting to see a way out of it. And I do want to go over this tweet by Donbas Devushka Politics. And in this tweet, they sort of lay out a couple of things I do want to point out. So NATO countries using nuclear weapons, they're saying that they're not going to, that the prospect is extremely distant, that they don't plan on doing this, right? And so that is something that, okay, it's important to point out that we're not there yet, but we definitely could be if this continues in the route it continues. Now, NATO also called on all countries to stop providing any assistance to Russia in its war with Ukraine, particularly as the Turkey question, right? We've seen Turkey work with Sweden to give its bid and to NATO, something that Erdogan had run on. He ran on this campaign of saying, we're not going to do that. We're not going to fulfill this. Then he turned around and did it. This shouldn't be surprising because Erdogan and Turkey have always played both sides. This is something they're known for. But this is a sort of pressure that NATO is pushing on. The idea is that Turkey did that because of the vice versa effect, that they also want assurances guaranteed for them by NATO. Now, they also NATO also highlighted that the strategic partnership between China and Russia is contrary to the values and the interests of the alliance. I mean, they're being very, very transparent in telling you this stuff. I mean, they're literally telling you that China-Russia relationships, which are getting stronger than ever, are contrary to what NATO wants, because NATO wants to expand into the Asia Pacific. So right now, everybody's looking at Ukraine and Russia, but behind Russia, this is something I've always said, is China. And that is their next target. And so they have, of course, looked to this military base in Japan that they're trying to build. And of course, Japan is a longtime ally of NATO, but there are other countries there in the region, like North Korea, that aren't really happy with this. And it's the Asia Pacific region is pretty much divided in terms of their desire to ally with NATO. But China is a big player in the Asia Pacific. I mean, this is a known fact. And so what we're going to see in the coming months and years is the shift and the pivot to the Asia Pacific. Why is the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, expanding into the Asia Pacific? They're supposed to be in the North Atlantic. Does no one even question this anymore? You know, this is something that is really insane to me, that people are okay with this. Well, they can if they want to. No, this was not supposed to happen, right? They said not one more inch. We know that this was, of course, a bunch of lies. And so they're also saying, by the way, that they intend a couple of things. They intend to keep communication open with Moscow, and they intend to de-escalate the situation. And they don't want war with Russia, but they also don't consider Russia a partner. The reality is NATO was created in opposition to the Soviet Union. That's what it was created for. And now what's left of the Soviet Union that they have been trying to collapse for decades, admittedly, is Russia. And so their only existence is if Russia is defeated, which is why, once again, this is an existential war for NATO and an existential war for Russia. It didn't start out that way for Russia. It started out as a special military operation. But at this point, it has become a fight for the existence and integrity of the country as a whole. And NATO is essentially fighting for its existence in the world right now, because it has no purpose other than to destroy Russia and break it up into small little ethnic states that it can control, just like it's been doing to the Balkans now for decades. And that is their purpose. Anybody that tells you different is lying. That is essentially the reason they exist. There is no other reason that they have. And so that is the intention to after Russia is to expand into the Pacific and take down China. And now I want to bring Tara on to discuss the NATO summit and to discuss Putin's latest words whenever you have her camped in and ready, because Tara pays a lot of attention to these issues, and she's here in Moscow. And this is something that has been talked about, but let's talk about it in the context of, really, Tara, what did Ukraine get? Do you see this as a win for Ukraine in any way, shape, or form, or is this more of just like platitudes that are continually thrown at Ukraine?
Oh, this is just basically platitudes, in my opinion. But it also shows that there's just like no attempt for diplomacy from the U.S. I mean, it's or NATO, right? It's just, in fact, NATO countries are even pushing really hard to fast track Ukraine and skip a step, which they're not doing for other countries. I think it's ridiculous. I think the fact that Finland and Sweden are now part of it's a mess. And you addressed it very well and very eloquently when you said the sole purpose of NATO is to try to break up Russia and put it into ethnic states, like you were saying. That's exactly what the intent is. It is not a peacekeeping or defensive alliance. It is a warmongering one, which it's proved over and over with Afghanistan, with other endless wars, right? 20 years of that,
Yeah, and I love that you pointed that out, because this is what they describe themselves. We are a peacekeeping defensive alliance that is just existing to maintain peace in the world, but they have pushed nothing but destruction and war. And this is not some sort of ideological thing I'm saying. This is a reality. As you mentioned, the war in Iraq and other wars. You can go back to any war in the Gulf and any war in the last 30 years.
They were involved with all of them. Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yugoslavia. That's a huge one. I mean, look at what happened with former Yugoslavia. I mean, that was a genocide, right?
Yeah, and this is the idea is, of course, going in to rescue a certain sector, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Bosnians, whether it's whatever, the Uyghurs and the Taiwanese from the evils of the Chinese or the Russians. Like, that is always it. And so it really doesn't matter, though, in the United States who's in power, because one of the things that we have to point out as Americans, Tara, when I don't think people here in Russia understand the dynamics as much. The Democrats like to blame Russians, but the Republicans like to blame the Chinese. So we're covered on both ends of the spectrum on everything, right? They on one way with one administration or the other, somebody wants to go to war with either Russia or China, and that's just how it's covered at one point or another. So whoever we get as president, next year, whoever is selected as president, they're going to continue some type of foreign policy. I just don't see that changing. Do you see this conflict in any way changing, depending on the U.S. election?
Well, I mean, I don't know, as far as like if there's someone who's a little more inclined for peace with Russia and not this proxy war, then perhaps, but look at the candidates. I mean, yeah, there's some that are giving some mouthpiece to it, like, RFK is being, has been outspoken against it. I think Pasta's covered that quite extensively. But the reality is his son fought for Ukraine. His sister-in-law or daughter-in-law is a member of the CIA and has been for decades. He's part of an elite family. He's part of the elites. So once he got into office, would he stay, hold the same line? Or again, continue with the aggression towards Russia? I don't know. I mean, he wouldn't make it that far. He won't make it to the primary. And when he gets to the primary, because he's a Democrat, he's going to endorse Biden. And that's what they're going to do. And if Biden physically can't make it to the presidency, they'll replace him with Gavin Newsom, who has made it clear that he is very lacking in foreign policy and pretty much toes the line and was, pro, or Ukraine, and didn't even question the proxy war. So I don't hold much hope for the election itself. But what I do have hope, if you listen to President Putin, he is still talking about wanting to come to some sort of peaceful negotiation. I think it was just the other day he was talking about, the agreement or proposed agreement that was trying to be moved forward in Istanbul, Turkey, that he said it got thrown in the trash bin basically by Ukraine.
Yeah.
But that, they were still open to really, he sounds still open, and the Russians have made it clear, and the Russian delegation at the UN have made it clear that they still want to talk about peace. But, as long as, the weapons manufacturers like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and, these warmongers are getting a bunch of money lining their pockets, we're not going to get diplomacy.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I do have to point out, and I'm glad you also pointed it out, is that Russia at every turn has tried to negotiate. At this point, I think things are going to be decided on the battlefield, it seems, because there doesn't seem to be a real negotiation coming from the West. But there is a shift, I think, in Zelensky. I think the NATO summit did prove that Zelensky has been looked on as somebody that is not a diplomat, as somebody that is super emotional, that will have his outbursts. He's getting billions and billions of dollars. He's getting so much ammunition from all of these countries. And he went on to criticize the NATO contingent as to why he's not being admitted into NATO itself. And, all Zelensky got was this council, the Ukrainian council that they're creating to sort of, just give him another bit of a dangling carrot. Do you think that Ukraine will ever be admitted into NATO? And what do you think that would mean if they are?
I think what it is if there's certain people in NATO leadership that want to do the fast track for Ukraine, but I think that there's others that do not. And I mean, remember, and we've talked about this before, just 4 years ago, Ukraine was dubbed by BBC, by the mainstream press, as the most corrupt country in the world. So these leaders that were there at NATO, many of them were leaders at that time and still have the same concerns. So I find it hard to believe that they're really going to just fast track Ukraine, particularly while it's at war. I mean, that's against the actually their own, rules. So are they going to make an exception for Ukraine? I don't know. It's just crazy how this country that was called the most corrupt country in the world is the focal point of so many billions of dollars and so much money laundering. And, my hope is that as more and more of the money laundering is being revealed and the corruption now, that they'll have to pull back, because there are elections coming, in other countries. I mean, Macron's barely holding on to his majority. He's not popular. Many of the leaders in power are losing their consensus about this proxy war. I don't know if that's my perception. What is yours?
Yeah, I mean, I do think I agree with you. Earlier, I was mentioning that specifically France, Spain, and Germany have been hit really hard by the, of course, lack of energy, the lack of petrol, the economic fallout from this conflict, and they seem to be voicing their concerns far more. And historically, France has been more critical of NATO's actions. They were more critical of the war in Iraq. They have been more independent than others. So this isn't the first time, but we'll have to see where, because Macron, as you said, he's not popular, where they fall into this. And the other thing, Tara, I wanted to bring up with you is the announcement by Putin that Russia will not renew the Green Deal unless Ukraine and NATO fulfill their part of the deal. They feel like they have not fulfilled their part of the deal. What do you think the West is going to do now that Putin has said that? Because one of the criticisms on Russia coming from a lot of analysts was they shouldn't have renewed the deal because the Ukraine is pretty much, stomping all over any sort of agreements they had. But now it seems like Russia is saying, no, we're not going to do it anymore. And we're not going to allow you to bully us into, saying that we're the ones that are not helping developing nations when most of the grain is still going to Europe.
Right. I mean, I think they're just drawing a red line because so many promises have been made and broken, and so many things have come into play that have trying to thwart Russia. And I mean, come on. I mean, just in the recent few months, the Nord Stream pipeline, which was a war crime, and it's still, the UN Security Council brought it up again recently. What's happening with the investigation? What's going on with this? We can't just keep ignoring it, but they are. The Russian delegation keeps trying to bring it up, and the U.S. keeps pushing it off because they know they were responsible, as Seymour Hersh, wrote out in his article, with Norway and blew up that pipeline. You have those blatant acts of aggression to try to economically cripple Russia's economy, like that war crime, as well as the sanctions. And then you have the grain deal where Russia is a major power, and the U.S. simply doesn't want to accept that. And I had mentioned this before when I worked on the Hill. It was right after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they had said, the same politicians that are in power now had said in a meeting that they would never allow Russia to have a seat at the table. And while Russia more than has a seat at the table, it has a table. I mean, it's a very powerful, force in the East. And we are in a multipolar world, and the West is refusing to accept it. I think what would be better rather than war is to have healthy economic competition rather than war, because that leads to innovation, that leads to positive outcomes, rather than, what we're experiencing with these embargoes and sanctions, and which are acts of violence and end up hurting working class people. I mean, let's face it, the sanctions aren't helping hurting the elites. Those hurt the working class. And the sanctions aren't hurting Russia at all. And you and I both live in Moscow. There is no sign of any problems for people here. The problems are in Europe and the US with the economy. So, yeah.
And, every country has areas where they can improve on. But as a visitor to this country, I don't spend all my days trying to say what they could or could not be doing. And that's for any country that I've ever visited. Right. But I do think that the Russian economy is actually growing. And we see this every day. Comparatively, I was just in the United States, as you know, and I was telling you about how expensive everything is and how it's just so hard to afford things. And people, businesses are really falling behind. They're closing down. There's so much poverty. It's increasing crime. That just shows you a society in decline. And, you can tell a lot by a country with how they treat their most vulnerable. Here you have healthcare, you have education, you have more of that safety net aspect that we do not have in the United States, that we can't even fight for in the United States, because you have people in Congress that are supposed to be progressive, like the Squad, endorsing Biden on the day he approved to send cluster munitions. Okay. And that is something that is extremely scary. What do you think about the cluster munitions, real quick? Like, what do you think of the audacity to send those at this rate.
It's horrific. It's horrific, Fee. You know, Laos, right? 50 years after the cluster bombs were released and carpet bombing that they did in Laos, 50 years later, children and civilians were getting blown up by duds. Even if there's 6 to 7% of duds, right? That's 4 out of 72 will detonate. These cluster bombs, and if your audience doesn't know, they're like, imagine a bomb that goes off and then 100 little bombs that go off, they tear off limbs, that they do such damage. They kill, they maim, they're awful. And they have duds. And so they're just like in the soil. So they're going to make, you know, and to remind everyone, Princess Diana tried to bring attention to landmines and bring attention to this issue. And 100 countries banned them and said it was a war crime to use them. Last year, Jen Psaki went on, you know, to say that they were accusing Russia of having them, but had no evidence that they were using them, and then said, well, this is a war crime if Russia is using these. And then they go, and then now they've already sent 800 million a package, plus some other weapons. I mean, it's disgusting, because who's going to suffer again? Working people, civilians, children.
Yeah, these are similar to the pedal mines that are in Donbass, and that journalist Eva Bartlett has been covering and talking about a lot, and how they've been maimed, and over 100 people have been maimed by these and killed actually by these bombs, and thousands more have been maimed. And this is I mean, these are so hard to see too. These are very similar. Years later they can also still kill people, and as you said, and countries like Laos and Cambodia are still dealing with these years later. So yeah, this is a war crime. And if you're seeing members of NATO say you shouldn't do that, well, you're looking pretty bad if NATO is saying maybe this isn't a good idea. So that's where we're at in this conflict. And I guess the last question I want to ask you is this revelation from Erdogan that he is going to support that Turkey will support Sweden's ascension into NATO. He was talking about not doing it until he got enough guarantees with these terrorist groups. And now he seems to have switched. He actually ran on this. And now he's saying no. And so what do you make of that? And are you surprised?
Actually, no, because and you know what? Seymour Hersh just did a piece that came out this morning. You probably haven't had a chance to see it, but he talked about this directly, that what happened was that he received basically guarantees that he would get 13 to 15 billion line of credit, right? And Turkey suffered because of the earthquake. So basically they wanted that line of credit. And frankly, you know, Turkey's always played both sides to the middle. That's their thing. Now, some people think it's like 5-dimensional chess, that he doesn't really like, you know, being with NATO, that they're a room full of vipers, which that's true, a room full of vipers, and that he's like navigating it, you know, and whatever. But I don't know. I think, you know, Russia will have its reaction as it does. They seem to be understanding their position. Probably it's a monetary decision out of desperation and need because of, you know, the devastating earthquake and then needing that line of credit. But it sets them up for being kind of sucked into that whole structure, and with the World Economic Forum as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess to finish this off, you were here during the whole Prigozhin debacle, the attempted mutiny. What do you think of that in terms of, has it affected Russia in the way that it was portrayed? And what exactly do you think Russia has gotten out of that whole event?
You know what I thought was funny was the headlines were so ridiculous in the West. Russia's devolving into civil war. There's a, you know, whatever. And anyway, if you were here in Moscow, which I was, it was very quiet. And when you asked Moscovites, they were like, oh, okay, well, you know, it looks like they're having some battles up above our head. You know, these are between the military heads. They're battling it out and having arguments about strategy and approaches, but it'll work out. So it wasn't really, people didn't seem to be very afraid about it. They seemed very secure. And so I thought that was interesting. Russians tend to be very calm, but the Western headlines were very hysterical. And then they were, of course, having to eat crow because None of those things happened. And it's still a question mark in my mind about Prigozhin and what all of that meant. I don't think we're going to know for a long time. I think it did weed out some of the people that were being disloyal, perhaps, that revealed something. Other than that, I being new to this country, I don't even want to try to guess at what is really happening with that whole scenario. I really don't know. I've heard so many different theories from people that would know that are close, but always something a little different that I'm like, okay, nobody knows except the very top.
Yeah, it seems like nobody knows for sure what exactly happened. And I've had many discussions with many people on this whole thing. And, I've come to the conclusion that I think it's just not entirely just a nicely tied story we were told, but I don't believe it's a psyop either. I believe that this stuff really happened. But there's definitely things that clearly happening behind the scenes. But I do think that, what the United States and NATO wanted did not happen, that Putin would be removed, that Russia would collapse, that all of this, Russia's just continuing on their military strategy as they were before. They are continuing their diplomatic efforts abroad. They had a delegation sent to China. They are, Lavrov has been everywhere from Africa to the Middle East. And there's all of this is moving around every single day. So we're not really seeing any stop to that. And, things are continuing to unfold. So
did you see that thing with Lavrov, that thing with Lavrov? He was visiting and he was like a rock star. Did you see they were all trying to get photos with him and clamoring with him
recently, right?
Yeah, it was yesterday or today, but they were like clamoring around him like he was a rock star, trying to get photos with him, kneeling down in front of him, and he had to tell him to get up and he would take photos with them. But it kind of made me laugh because it's that myth that Russia's isolated, when actually when their delegation goes out, be it a diplomat or be it President Putin or whoever it is, they're like greeted very enthusiastically and warmly. And it's because people see that they are not bending a knee to the West, to Western hegemony. People are sick of the endless wars, and they're seeing that Russia is taking a different tactic, that they're trying to move towards peace, that they're trying to protect the people of Donbass, that they're trying to get rid of Nazis. And, they're not, it's not what it is for the West, which is, again, just another way to make money off of weapons,
Yeah. No, it's anytime a Lavrov or another diplomat go anywhere, they are welcomed and well received in the African continents and in the Asian continents as well. So that's definitely a reality. I guess we'll be seeing, what happens next every day. There's so much going on, but the NATO summit was definitely not what the media were making it out to be for Ukraine. It just basically showed Ukraine as a proxy for NATO's agenda against Russia. And I think the verdict is that Ukraine really just got what it's been getting, munitions and platitudes, but it's not really going to get that sweet spot in the NATO bloc. So Tara, why don't you tell people what's up next for you and where they can find you?
Well, normally you can find me on Twitter at Reed Alexandra, but for some reason my Twitter's suspended. I'm not sure why. So hopefully I'll be back. Hopefully my account will come back. We'll see. If not, hopefully your audience can go out there and say, hey, give her account back. But you can find me on Telegram just by my name, Tara Reed. And I have a public channel and my podcast, which is The Politics of Survival. And you are going to come on tomorrow night and we're going to talk about a whole range of things. But I wanted to talk about your recent visit to the U.S. and your recent travels that you made to elsewhere. So hopefully your audience will tune in to The Politics of Survival. We'll have it on all the platforms and Rumble, and you'll be there, and we'll be live at 11 p.m. Moscow time.
All right. Sounds good, Tara. And thanks all of you for watching. I'll see you. Pasta will be on Friday. I'm not sure exactly what time, but I believe it's going to be earlier, maybe 10 a.m. Pacific. So tune into that, and then I'll be on with Tara later on in the day. Thanks so much for tuning in. Convo out. See ya.